He thought she was the catering staff. He would realize 3 minutes later that she was the one person in the world who could erase his company with a signature, and he would spend the remaining 41 seconds of his tenure as Chief Executive Officer trying to remember whether he had said please. The boardroom of Grayson Medical Technologies sat on the 47th floor of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan. 16 executives arranged around a mahogany conference table that had been custom-built in 2019 for a company that had at that time been valued at $1.4 billion. The company was now, on this particular Thursday morning in October, valued at approximately negative $84 million, though the negative sign was still theoretical because the entity that could make the negative sign real had not yet arrived in the room. Robert Grayson, 58 years old, Chief Executive Officer for the past 11 years, was sweating through the collar of a shirt that had cost $340 and had been pressed that morning by a housekeeper he paid in cash. He was staring at the conference room door, which had been closed for the past 14 minutes, and he was doing the mathematics of a man whose company was 48 hours away from defaulting on a $300 million loan. An assistant had set out coffee approximately 20 minutes earlier, along with a box of pastries from a bakery on Madison Avenue that Grayson had insisted on because he had once read in a business publication that small courtesies mattered in high-stakes negotiations. No one was touching the coffee. No one was touching the pastries. The room smelled faintly of butter and desperation, and the 16 executives around the table were making the small, meaningless movements that people make when they are trying to project competence to a person who has not yet walked into the room. The chief financial officer, Marcus, was pretending to read an email on his phone. The general counsel, a man named Peterson, was arranging and rearranging a set of documents in front of him in a stack that had already been perfectly arranged 4 times. The senior vice president of investor relations was drinking water from a glass that had been empty for 6 minutes. She was drinking the empty glass because the physical motion gave her something to do with her hands. Grayson was doing none of these things. He was staring at the door. He had built this company, or so he told himself in the story he had told about himself for the past 11 years. He had inherited it, technically, from his father, who had founded it in 1978. He had been named Chief Executive Officer at the age of 47 following a board process that had lasted approximately 3 weeks and had involved no external candidates and no meaningful competition. He had grown the company aggressively for 6 years and then had grown it recklessly for the 4 years after that. And now the aggressive growth and the reckless growth were sitting together on his balance sheet like 2 guests who had arrived at a dinner party neither of them had been invited to. The $300 million loan had been the mechanism by which he had funded the last 2 acquisitions. Both acquisitions had failed. The loan was now due. The company did not have the money. The only entity in the world that could restructure the loan and save the company was a private debt fund called Mercier Strategic Capital, whose founder had agreed the previous evening to a last-minute in-person meeting that morning at 9:00 a.m. It was now 9:16 a.m. The founder had not arrived. Grayson had never met the founder. He had communicated with the fund exclusively through intermediaries. He had assumed, without ever quite thinking the assumption through, that the founder was a man probably in his 60s, probably named something like Charles or David or Michael, probably the kind of person Grayson could speak to lawyer and executive to executive. The door opened. A woman walked in. She was in her early 40s. She was black. She was wearing a dark charcoal blazer over a cream shell blouse, dark tailored trousers, and low black heels that had been chosen specifically because they made no sound on marble floors. She was carrying a slim leather portfolio under her left arm. She had walked into the room the way a person walks into a room they have already decided the outcome of. She stopped just inside the door. She looked around. Her eyes moved across the room in the careful, evaluative sweep of a person confirming that she was in the correct location, and then her eyes stopped on Robert Grayson, who was seated at the head of the table, and her expression did not change. Grayson barely glanced at her. He had been staring at the door for 16 minutes waiting for a specific person, and the person he had been waiting for had not arrived. The person who had actually walked through the door did not, in the instantaneous calculation that his brain performed without his permission, match the template of the person he was expecting. The template of the person he was expecting had been assembled from 35 years of corporate meetings and 11 years of running a publicly traded medical device company and approximately 200 introductions to founders of private debt funds. The template was a white man in his 60s in an expensive suit with an air of quiet financial menace. The woman who had walked through the door did not match the template. The template executed a different response. The response was catering. "Finally," Grayson said. He said it without looking at her carefully. He said it in the tone of a man who had been waiting too long for a service he had paid for. "Coffee. Black, no sugar. And clear these plates while you're at it. We're about to start a meeting." The room went still. It did not go still because anyone in the room recognized the woman. It went still because the tone Grayson had used had been that casual, that dismissive, that indifferent. Marcus, the chief financial officer, looked up from his phone for the first time in 6 minutes. Peterson, the general counsel, stopped arranging his documents mid-motion. The senior vice president of investor relations set her empty water glass down on the table so slowly and so carefully that it made no sound. Everyone in the room understood in some subterranean, not yet articulated way that something had just happened that would matter, though none of them yet knew what. The woman did not move. She looked at Grayson for one long, quiet beat. It was not a hostile look. It was not an offended look. It was the look of a person who had just received a piece of information she had been informally testing for and had now confirmed. Her face did not change. Her posture did not change. She simply looked at him, and the look lasted approximately 4 seconds, which is a length of time that does not sound long when described, but is an eternity when experienced in a room where 16 executives have just realized that they should have been paying closer attention to something they had not been paying attention to at all. Then she turned. She walked back through the door she had just entered. She closed it behind her with the same soundless precision with which she had opened it. The door clicked shut, and the sound of the click was somehow louder than any sound the door had made when it opened. Grayson exhaled. He turned back to Peterson. "Where the hell is Mercier? We've been waiting almost 20 minutes. Peterson did not answer immediately. He was staring at the door. He had, in the 4 seconds during which the woman had looked at Grayson, begun to formulate a suspicion that was not yet fully formed but was moving toward form with the reluctant, terrible momentum of a suspicion that a man does not want to have. "Robert," Peterson said carefully, "I think we may have a problem." Grayson looked at Peterson. Peterson had worked as the company's general counsel for the past 7 years. He was a cautious man by temperament and a careful man by training, and he had spent 7 years developing an extremely accurate calibration for the specific tone he used when he was about to tell Robert Grayson something Robert Grayson did not want to hear. The tone he had just used was that tone. Grayson recognized it. He did not want to hear whatever Peterson was about to say. He said it anyway. "What are you talking about, Peterson?" Peterson took a breath. He was looking at the door. The woman who just walked in. The caterer. I don't think she was the caterer, Robert. The room had already been silent. It became a different kind of silent. It became the silent of a room in which 16 people had simultaneously begun to run the same calculation and had arrived, one by one, at answers they did not want to have arrived at. Marcus, the chief financial officer, had put his phone down entirely. The senior vice president of investor relations had gone the specific pale that people go when their blood pressure drops in response to information they have not yet consciously processed. Peterson was still looking at the door. "What are you talking about?" Grayson said again. His voice had risen slightly. It had not yet risen to alarm, but it had left the register of certainty. "Who was she?" Peterson did not answer. Peterson was calculating, in the way that senior legal counsel calculate in moments of professional catastrophe. How much of what he now suspected he should say aloud in a room that contained 15 other executives, and how much he should save for the private conversation with Grayson that he suspected would occur within the next 4 hours, and would very likely be the last conversation of Grayson's tenure as chief executive officer. He did not have to answer. The door opened again. The woman walked back in. She did not walk in alone this time. She was flanked by two men in dark suits, both of whom were carrying leather portfolios of their own, both of whom moved with the crisp, uninflected efficiency of people who have done exactly this kind of walking many times before in many different rooms. Behind the two men was a third person, a woman with a laptop and a shoulder bag who moved to the side of the room and sat up at a small side table without acknowledging anyone. She opened the laptop. She began to type. Nobody in the room yet understood that she was a stenographer. Peterson understood. Peterson closed his eyes for approximately 1 second and then opened them again. The woman with the leather portfolio walked to the head of the table. She did not sit. She stood on the opposite side of the table from Grayson, facing him directly, and she placed her portfolio on the mahogany surface with the same soundless precision she had used to close the door 4 minutes earlier. She did not look at Grayson. She looked at the room. Her eyes moved across the 16 executives one by one, and each of them, when her eyes landed on them, felt the specific sensation of being individually cataloged. Then the taller of the two men in suits stepped forward. He was in his 50s. He had the bearing of a man who had spent 25 years in litigation and had learned somewhere around year 12 that the most effective courtroom voice was a voice that never rose. He addressed the room in that voice now. "Good morning. My name is David Kellerman. I am lead counsel for Mercier Strategic Capital. To my left is my colleague, Jonathan Weiss, senior partner at the same firm. To my right," he paused, "is Angela Mercier, founder and controlling partner of Mercier Strategic Capital. She holds the default right on your loan. She is here to sign the liquidation order, not to negotiate." The room did not react. The room could not react. The room had entered a state of collective paralysis in which the individual nervous systems of 16 executives were simultaneously attempting to process a piece of information that reorganized the entire meaning of the previous 4 minutes. Marcus, the chief financial officer, dropped his pen. It was a small motion. It made a small sound. In the total silence of the room, it made a sound that was much larger than its physical volume, and Angela Mercier's eyes moved to the pen where it had rolled across the mahogany and come to a stop against the edge of a coffee saucer. She looked at the pen for 1 beat. Then she looked at Marcus. Marcus did not meet her eyes. He was, in his own private mental accounting, already drafting the resignation letter he would send by the end of the day, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he understood that the company he was chief financial officer of was going to cease existing within the next hour, and he wanted to be on record as having resigned before the ceasing was complete. Robert Grayson's face had drained of color. It had drained the way faces drain when the blood has been called elsewhere to service an emergency the brain has not yet articulated. He was looking at Angela Mercier. He was trying, in real time, to reconcile the woman he had spoken to 4 minutes earlier with the woman who was now standing across from him. The reconciliation was not going well. His mouth had opened. He had not yet produced any sound. He was attempting to produce sound and failing. Angela Mercier had still not spoken. She had not needed to. Kellerman had spoken for her, and Kellerman's introduction had rearranged the room in a way that made further introduction unnecessary. She was now, however, going to speak. She had spent the previous 4 minutes in the hallway outside the boardroom having a very brief conversation with Kellerman about whether to proceed with the meeting at all. Kellerman had asked her, in the same soundless precision he applied to everything, whether she wanted to walk back in or whether she wanted him to walk in alone and inform the room that the meeting was canceled and that the liquidation would proceed by written order. She had thought about it for approximately 8 seconds. Then she had said, "No, I want to walk back in. I want him to see me." Kellerman had nodded. He had understood the answer completely. He had been Angela Mercier's lead counsel for 9 years, and he had learned during those 9 years that when Angela made a decision that carried a small element of personal presence, the decision was almost always the correct one, and the personal presence was almost always the reason. She opened the portfolio now. She removed a single document from the portfolio. The document was 3 pages long. It had been prepared the previous evening in the offices of Kellerman's law firm. It had been reviewed by 4 attorneys. It had been signed by Angela at 7:14 that morning in the back of the car that had brought her to the building. It required only one additional signature to become operative. The additional signature was hers, made in the presence of witnesses, on the 3rd page, in the space that had been left blank pending the outcome of the meeting. She placed the document on the table. She reached down and picked up the pen that Marcus had dropped. She held the pen loosely in her right hand. She looked at Robert Grayson. "Mr. Grayson," she said. Her voice was calm. It was not raised. It carried across the conference table with the clarity of a voice that had been trained over many years to carry without effort. "You had 48 hours to prepare for this meeting. You had 48 hours to give me one reason, one specific, articulable reason, why Mercier Strategic Capital should restructure your loan instead of exercising its default right. You had 48 hours to prepare a presentation. You had 48 hours to prepare a business case. You had 48 hours to prepare, at minimum, a courteous introduction." She paused. "You just gave me a better reason to let this company die than any reason you could possibly have given me for saving it." The pen was still in her hand. She had not yet used it. She was giving Grayson exactly the amount of time she had decided in the hallway that she would give him. The amount was not generous. It was, however, more than most people would have given him. It was, in the end, more than he deserved. Grayson finally produced sound. It came out hoarse. Came out at a volume slightly higher than the volume Angela had used, which was the first mistake of the several mistakes he was about to make in the next 90 seconds. "Ms. Mercier, I did not know. I did not recognize you. If I had known who you were, I would never have. Obviously, this is a terrible misunderstanding. I apologize. I sincerely apologize. Please, please sit down. Let's start this meeting over. Let's start fresh." Angela did not sit. She did not move. She looked at him for a moment that lasted 3 seconds and felt like 15. "Mr. Grayson," she said, "I am going to explain something to you, and I am going to explain it once. The reason I am going to explain it is not because I owe you an explanation. I do not owe you an explanation. The reason I am going to explain it is because there are 15 other people in this room whose livelihoods and reputations are about to be affected by what I do in the next 4 minutes, and I want them to hear the reasoning directly from me rather than reconstructing it later from rumor. Do you understand?" Grayson nodded. He did not speak. He had somewhere in the previous 30 seconds regained enough situational awareness to understand that speaking was not currently in his interest. "Good. Here is the reasoning. When you spoke to me 4 minutes ago, you did not know who I was. That is correct. You did not, however, need to know who I was in order to speak to me the way you would speak to a colleague. The default posture of a professional adult in a professional environment is courtesy. You did not extend courtesy. You extended a command. You extended a command to a person you had assumed in the space of less than 1 second was catering staff. I want to be clear that I have no objection to catering staff. Catering staff perform important work. Catering staff also, in every professional environment I have ever entered, deserve to be spoken to as adults, not as furniture. You did not speak to me as an adult. You spoke to me as furniture." She paused. She was still holding the pen. That in itself would not be sufficient reason to liquidate a $300 million loan. I want to make that clear as well. I am not liquidating this company because you were rude to me. I am not that petty, and Mercier Strategic Capital is not that reactive. What you did in the 4 minutes before I walked back into this room, however, told me something I could not have learned from any number of business presentations. It told me who you are when you believe no one important is watching." She looked around the room. Her eyes moved from executive to executive. That is the single most important piece of information I could have received before making this decision, because a $300 million loan restructuring is not, in the end, a decision about a balance sheet. It is a decision about a person. It is a decision about whether the person running the company can be trusted to run the company competently, ethically, and with the kind of judgment that would allow the loan to be repaid. You just showed me, in a controlled test that you did not know you were taking, exactly what your judgment looks like when you believe the stakes are low. Your judgment when you believe the stakes are low is bad. I have no reason to believe your judgment when the stakes are high is any better. In fact, I have significant reason to believe it is worse, because I have spent the last 72 hours reviewing the two acquisitions you made with the proceeds of this loan, both of which failed for reasons that were entirely predictable to anyone who had spent 40 minutes on the underlying due diligence. She paused again. You did not spend 40 minutes on the underlying due diligence. You spent 40 minutes on the press release. The room was silent. Peterson, the general counsel, had closed his eyes again. Angela Mercier had not raised her voice at any point in the previous 3 minutes. She had not needed to. Her voice was carrying the room the way a well-constructed argument carries a courtroom, which is to say without effort and without opposition. She was now going to do something that none of the 16 executives in the room expected her to do. She was going to sit down. She pulled out the chair at the head of the table opposite Grayson. She sat down. She placed the pen carefully on top of the document. She folded her hands on the table in front of her. She looked at Grayson. Mr. Grayson, I am going to give you an opportunity. I want to be clear that I am not obligated to give you this opportunity. I am giving it to you for reasons that are entirely my own and that I am not going to explain. Do you understand? Grayson nodded. He had not spoken in the previous 4 minutes. He had learned finally, at the age of 58, after 35 years of speaking his way out of every difficult conversation he had ever been in, that the current conversation was not one he was going to speak his way out of. The opportunity is this. I am going to give you 15 minutes. In those 15 minutes, you are going to tell me, without notes, without slides, and without the assistance of anyone else in this room, exactly what happened with the Hendricks acquisition and exactly what happened with the Perlman acquisition. You are going to tell me the truth. You are going to tell me the parts you told your board, and you are going to tell me the parts you did not tell your board. You are going to tell me specifically what you knew at the time of each acquisition that you chose not to disclose, and you are going to tell me why. She paused. At the end of the 15 minutes, I am going to make a decision. The decision will be one of two things. The first possible decision is that I sign this document. This company enters liquidation this afternoon, and you spend the next 18 months in litigation with your shareholders, your bondholders, and possibly the Securities and Exchange Commission. The second possible decision is that I do not sign this document today, that Mercier Strategic Capital enters into a 90-day standstill agreement with Grayson Medical Technologies, and that during those 90 days you and I have a series of conversations about whether there is a version of this company that can continue to exist under different management. To be clear, in the second scenario, you would not be the different management. You would resign as Chief Executive Officer within 30 days. Your compensation package on exit would be negotiated between your counsel and mine. The negotiation would not be generous. Do you understand the two options? Grayson had gone still. He was not looking at Angela anymore. He was looking at the surface of the table. He was, in the way that a certain kind of man does when the entire architecture of his self-image has been revealed to him in real time to be structurally unsound, attempting to hold it together for approximately 8 more seconds so that he could get through the next sentence without breaking down. I understand. Good. The 15 minutes begins now. I would suggest that you use them carefully. This is the last professional conversation you and I will ever have, regardless of which option I select. Whatever you say in the next 15 minutes will be the last impression you leave on me. Choose it accordingly. She did not start a timer. She did not need to. Kellerman, standing 3 feet to her left, had already started one on his phone. The stenographer at the side of the room was typing. The other 15 executives in the room had not moved. Grayson took a breath. He looked up. He looked at Angela. And then, to his own surprise as much as anyone else's, he began to tell the truth. He began with the Hendricks acquisition. He had been told by the 2 investment bankers who brought him the deal that Hendricks Diagnostics was a strong strategic fit, and that the revenue numbers, while soft in the most recent quarter, reflected temporary supply chain issues that would resolve within 6 months. He had known at the time, he now admitted, that the revenue numbers reflected something considerably more permanent than a supply chain issue. He had known this because his own head of corporate development had prepared a memo 11 days before the acquisition closed that identified the revenue decline as structural rather than transitory. He had read the memo. He had not shared the memo with his board. He had not shared the memo with his general counsel. He had filed the memo in a folder on his personal drive that he had subsequently deleted. Peterson, sitting 4 seats down the table, opened his eyes. He looked at Grayson with the expression of a general counsel who has just learned in real time and in front of witnesses that his client had made a materially fraudulent disclosure to a corporate board 18 months earlier. He did not speak. He was already, in the private mental accounting that had begun 12 minutes earlier, drafting the letter he would send to the board of directors within the hour, informing them that he could no longer represent Robert Grayson in his individual capacity and would be requiring separate counsel for the company going forward. Grayson continued. He moved to the Perlman acquisition. The Perlman acquisition had been worse. He had known Douglas Perlman socially for approximately 12 years. They had served together on the board of a private club in Greenwich, Connecticut. Perlman had approached him at a fundraiser in 2023 with the suggestion that Grayson Medical acquire Perlman Instruments as a strategic bolt-on. The strategic rationale had been assembled subsequently by the same investment bankers who had structured the Hendricks deal. The strategic rationale had been thin. Grayson had known the strategic rationale was thin. He had proceeded anyway because Douglas Perlman had been a friend, because Douglas Perlman had personally guaranteed a portion of Perlman Instruments' debt, and had needed the acquisition to close in order to avoid personal bankruptcy, and because Grayson had wanted, in some private corner of his own psychology, to be the man who saved Douglas Perlman from a fate that Douglas Perlman had brought upon himself through 15 years of poor decisions. He said all of this. He said it without stopping. He said it in a voice that got smaller as it went, not because he was trying to be less audible, but because the accumulation of admissions was doing something to his diaphragm that he could not fully control. Angela Mercier did not interrupt. She did not take notes. She simply listened. The stenographer typed. Kellerman stood. When Grayson finished, he had been speaking for approximately 12 minutes. He had 3 minutes remaining. He did not use them. He looked at Angela. He said, "I don't have anything else. That's the truth. That's all of it." Angela looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you, Mr. Grayson. I want you to know that I appreciate what that just cost you. I want you to know that I am not going to pretend it did not cost you. It cost you a great deal. I want you also to know that it was, in the end, the correct choice, and I want you to know why." She paused. "The document I brought into this room today would have liquidated this company by the end of business. 1,500 people would have lost their jobs by Monday morning. The pension obligations would have been transferred to the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, where they would have been paid out at approximately 60 cents on the dollar. Your bondholders would have recovered approximately 40 cents on the dollar. Your equity holders would have recovered nothing. The catastrophe would have been complete, and it would have been, in a legal and financial sense, entirely justified." She reached out. She picked up the document. She did not sign it. She placed it back inside her portfolio. "I am not signing it today. I am going to explain why. I am going to explain it not for your benefit, Mr. Grayson, but for the benefit of the 15 other people in this room who, I want to be clear, are the reason I am not signing it. You are not the reason. You have given me no reason to save this company. The people who work at this company, however, are a different question. There are, According to the last filing I reviewed, 4,732 people employed by Grayson Medical Technologies. Approximately 1,500 of them work at the Hendricks facility in Ohio, which, despite the acquisition having been a strategic error, is a manufacturing operation that produces medical devices that hospitals actually use. Those hospitals will continue to need those devices. The people who make those devices will continue to need to work. And the community around that facility, which has been through 2 prior manufacturing closures in the past 20 years, does not, in my personal and unsentimental assessment, need to go through a third. She looked at Peterson. Mr. Peterson, I understand that you have professional decisions of your own to make in the next several hours. I am not going to interfere with any of them. I would ask, however, that before you make them, you have a private conversation with me. I have some thoughts about the structure of the next 90 days that I believe you will find useful, and I have a candidate in mind for interim chief executive officer that I would like your input on before I raise the name with the board. Peterson nodded. He did not speak. He had, in the previous 30 seconds, adjusted his internal expectations of what the rest of his afternoon was going to look like. He had begun to suspect that the afternoon was going to be considerably more constructive than he had feared 20 minutes earlier, and that he might, in the end, still have a client to represent when it was over. Angela turned to Marcus. Marcus had not moved in approximately 8 minutes. He was still looking at the pen, which was still sitting on the mahogany between them. Mr. Marcus, I have reviewed your work as Chief Financial Officer for the past 3 years. It has been competent. It has been more than competent. It has been, in several instances that I could name specifically but will not, notably better than the work of your Chief Executive Officer. I would like you to remain in your position through the 90-day standstill. I would like you to work directly with Mr. Kellerman and with the interim Chief Executive Officer once one is appointed. I would like you to know that your compensation during that period will be paid on time and in full, and that a retention bonus of an amount to be negotiated will be added to your package at the end of the 90 days if the company remains a going concern. Do you accept? Marcus finally looked up. He looked at Angela. He looked at Grayson. He looked back at Angela. Yes, Ms. Mercier, I accept. Good, please pick up your pen. Marcus reached out. He picked up the pen. It was a small motion. It made a small sound. In the accumulated silence of the previous 25 minutes, the small sound landed in the room with the specific weight of something that had just been made real. The pen was back in the hand of the Chief Financial Officer. The Chief Financial Officer was still the Chief Financial Officer. The company was still, for the next 90 days at least, a company. Angela stood up. Kellerman stood beside her. Weiss, who had not spoken at any point in the meeting, closed his portfolio with the same soundless precision that Angela had used to open hers. Mr. Grayson, Angela said. She was looking at him now with an expression that was not unkind. It was, however, entirely final. You will receive a resignation letter for your signature by 5:00 p.m. today. You will sign it. You will not negotiate its terms in the letter itself. You will negotiate its terms with your counsel and with Mr. Kellerman over the next 30 days. Your compensation on exit will reflect the fact that you concealed a material corporate development memo from your board of directors in connection with an acquisition that subsequently failed. It will reflect the fact that you approved a subsequent acquisition for personal rather than fiduciary reasons. It will reflect, in short, the facts as you just described them under your own admission in front of witnesses and on the record. I want you to prepare yourself, and I want you to prepare your family for what those facts mean. The compensation package will not be zero. It will also not be what you were expecting when you walked into this room this morning. It will be somewhere in between, and where in between will depend on the good faith with which you conduct yourself over the next 30 days. She paused. She looked at him one more time. I want to say one more thing before I leave, Mr. Grayson. I want to say it not because I think you need to hear it, but because I think the other people in this room need to hear me say it. She turned. She addressed the room. When I walked into this conference room 27 minutes ago, Mr. Grayson mistook me for catering staff. I want to be clear that this was not, in his own conscious mind, an act of malice. It was an act of default. It was the automatic execution of an assumption that had been built into his brain over 35 years of moving through corporate environments in which the senior decision makers were almost all white men, and the service staff were almost all women and people of color. His brain absorbed the pattern. The pattern became a template. The template became a default. When he saw me, the default executed. I want to be clear that I do not, in my own personal assessment, believe that Mr. Grayson is a bad person. I believe he is a man who has never once in his 58 years of life been required to examine the default. That is a very common condition. It is more common than not. It is the default of the default. She paused. I want the other people in this room to understand that the reason today happened the way it did is not that Mr. Grayson made a single mistake. It is that Mr. Grayson made a single mistake in front of the one person in the world who had both the institutional power and the personal willingness to name the mistake for what it was. Almost every woman and every person of color in every corporate environment in this country has been on the receiving end of the same mistake, made by the same kind of man, in the same kind of room, with the same kind of casualness. Almost none of them have been in the position I was in this morning. Almost all of them have absorbed it, filed it away, and continued with their work. I want you to think about that. I want you to think about what it means that the ratio of times this happens to the times there are consequences is what it is. And I want you to think, when you go back to your own offices and your own teams this afternoon, about whether there are people who work for you who have been absorbing the same mistake day after day from you and continuing with their work. She looked around the room. That is all I am going to say about it. I'm not going to lecture you further. I have a car waiting downstairs and a flight to catch this afternoon, and I have said what I came here to say. She turned. She walked toward the door. Kellerman and Weiss followed. The stenographer closed her laptop, packed her shoulder bag, and followed behind them. At the door, Angela stopped. She turned back. She looked at Robert Grayson one final time. Mr. Grayson, I hope you spend the next 30 years doing the work of understanding what happened in this room today. I want to be very clear that I do not need you to do that work for my benefit. I do not need anything from you. I hope you do it for your own. She left. The door closed behind her. The conference room was silent for approximately 40 seconds after the door closed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The 15 executives who were not Robert Grayson were engaged in the internal work of trying to understand what they had just witnessed and how they were going to describe it, or not describe it, to the people in their lives who would ask them what had happened at the meeting that morning. Robert Grayson was sitting at the head of the table with his hands folded in front of him, looking at a space on the mahogany surface that was approximately 6 inches to the left of his own reflection. He was not crying. He was, in a way that was more difficult to look at than crying would have been, simply not present. He had gone somewhere else. The body that remained at the table was performing the function of being a body while the person who normally occupied it processed information at a level that was not currently available to the room. Peterson stood up. He walked around the table. He put a hand briefly on Grayson's shoulder. He said quietly, "Robert, let's go to your office. We have some things to discuss." Grayson stood up. He followed Peterson out of the room. He did not look at anyone. He did not say anything. The two men left the boardroom, and the door closed behind them, and the remaining 14 executives sat for another 90 seconds before Marcus finally cleared his throat and said, "I think we should adjourn." The meeting adjourned. Robert Grayson signed his resignation letter at 4:47 p.m. that afternoon. The letter was announced to the market the following morning. Grayson Medical Technologies did not enter liquidation. It entered a 90-day standstill agreement with Mercier Strategic Capital, at the end of which it had a new chief executive officer, a restructured balance sheet, and a corporate development memo policy that required every material memo to be circulated to the board within 48 hours of its receipt by the chief executive officer. The Hendricks facility in Ohio remained open. The 1,500 people who worked there remained employed. Marcus received his retention bonus at the end of the 90 days and was subsequently promoted to president of the company, a position he held for the next 11 years. Peterson remained general counsel. He and Angela Mercier had a series of quiet quarterly lunches for the next several years, at which they discussed nothing of consequence and everything of consequence, in the way that two people who have been through a single defining professional experience together often do. Angela Mercier flew back to Boston that afternoon. She did not think about Robert Grayson very often in the years that followed. She had a fund to run. She had 47 employees, 23 portfolio companies, and a daughter in her third year of law school at Columbia, whose academic performance she monitored with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. She had, however, told the story of that morning exactly once to her daughter, over dinner in an Italian restaurant in the West Village 3 years later. Her daughter had listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When Angela was finished, her daughter had said, "Mom, why did you give him the 15 minutes? You didn't have to. You could have just signed the paper." Angela had thought about it for a long moment. "Because the 15 minutes weren't for him, sweetheart. The 15 minutes were for the 15 people in the room who were going to spend the next 20 years telling that story. I wanted them to be able to tell it the right way. I wanted them to be able to say that a black woman walked into a boardroom, was mistaken for the help, and instead of destroying the man who made the mistake, gave him the chance to tell the truth in front of witnesses. That's a different story. That's the story I wanted them to carry." Her daughter had nodded slowly. Then she had said, "Mom, I want to be a lawyer like you." Angela had smiled. "Baby," she said, "you're going to be better. If this story moved you, subscribe, like, comment, and tell us where you're watching from. We tell the stories of the women the world tries to look past. The founders, the attorneys, the surgeons, and the daughters who walked into rooms where they were not expected and refused to leave. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, that the room is wrong, not you. Peace.